So, firstly, greetings from Hamden in Connecticut, which is also home to Ireland's Great Hunger Institute at Quinnipiac University. I'm sitting here outside my home because, as you know, the world is in the grip of a pandemic. It's very serious, it hasn't peaked yet, and like so many other people, I'm very nervous about what this will bring. But rather than go and meet people face to face, as we have done with Great Famine Voices, Dr. Jason King suggested that we should do some filming. So, from my front garden, such as it is, hello, and I hope you are all healthy and with those you love. So today we're going to focus on Liverpool, and Liverpool, if you don't know, is the great city, the great port city in the northwest of England. I have to admit a great bias. My family emigrated from the west of Ireland to Liverpool, and so I spent many of my teenage years in that city. Those of you who know me, just to introduce a flippant note perhaps, I'm a great supporter of Liverpool Football Club. As with everything at the moment, all soccer, all games have been suspended. So we are sitting here today to share some recollections of what happened to Liverpool during the Great Famine, the Great Hunger, and perhaps to tease out some of the lessons for today. So just to provide some context, Liverpool in the middle of the 19th century was probably one of the poorest cities in the United Kingdom. It was also an extremely busy, bustling city because it was, again, probably the busiest port in the world at that stage. And for Europeans, it was the main transatlantic port to North America. But for those who lived in Liverpool, mostly life was impoverished, dirty, overcrowded, and dangerous. And it was into this cauldron of disease and early death that victims fleeing from the Irish famine arrived. And they started to arrive really following the second failure of the potato blight in 1846. By November 1846, people in Liverpool were already witnessing hordes of Irish people arriving at the port, and the parish authorities were also expressing concern. What were they going to do with these famine Irish? Many of whom who had no skills, many were disease-ridden, many didn't even speak English. And Liverpool, as a great Protestant city, really resented this influx of Irish Catholics. So the scene was set for some confrontation and for some disaster. It is estimated that during the famine years, roughly from about 1846 to 1853, as many as 1.5 million people travelled to Liverpool. About 3/4 of them went in the hope of then moving onwards to North America. Mostly America, but in the single year 1847, a higher number went to Canada. Most of those emigrants remain nameless. We don't know much about them, we don't know their stories, we don't know where they came from or where they ended up. An exception to this is the emigrants who came from Jamestown estate in May 1847. We now refer to them as the missing 1490. Approximately 1,490 people left Jamestown estate at the height of Black 47. We used to think they were evicted, but now it seems more likely they were persuaded to give up their little patches of land so that they would release the land to their landlord. Their landlord at the time was Major Dennis Mahon. He has been painted in many accounts as a villain, but really largely due to the work of Dr. Mark McGowan, Dr. Jason King, and others. We're now starting to see he was a man who was caught in a very difficult situation. He'd inherited the estate and it was greatly indebted. And years of the famine, of not receiving rents, increased that indebtedness. So to him, a solution was to persuade, encourage, and assist some of his tenants to go to Canada. And as we know, almost 1,500 of his tenants agreed, men, women, and children. But the journey to Canada was arduous. Roscommon is about 100 miles from Dublin. And we know that those people with their little children walked along the canal to Dublin. They must have often been hungry and exhausted, as they carried all their worldly possessions with them. When they got to Dublin, they spent some time there waiting to get a vessel onwards to Liverpool. The journey to Liverpool would have taken maybe 14 hours, maybe a bit more, depending on sea conditions. As somebody who has done that journey very often, I can tell you that small patch of Irish sea can be incredibly rough. The Strokestown tenants arrived in Liverpool, and in Liverpool they waited for ships to take them onwards to Canada. We traditionally think that they were carried by 4 ships, but again, due to some recent findings, it's possibly 5 ships that took them to Canada. They followed the traditional route, stopping at the quarantine station in Grosse Ile. But it's estimated that even before they arrived in Canada, maybe 400 of them had died. When they got to Grosse Ile, they had to wait approximately 2 weeks before they could be processed. Again, more people died during this waiting period. And then for those who survived, they went onwards to Montreal. And we know from the archives of the Grey Nuns, there they probably would have entered into fever sheds, and there they would have been looked after by the brave Grey Sisters and other religious orders. What we also know is that many of these people who came from Strokestown died either en route or in Canada or shortly afterwards. And this left a high number of orphans. And again, thanks to the research being done at Strokestown Park, we know some of the individual stories, what happened to these children. And we know that they not only lost their parents in this tragedy, but many of them, as a result of being adopted by French Canadian people, also lost their Irish culture and their identity. So when these Famine Irish arrived in Liverpool, what sort of relief were they entitled to? And most people now are aware of the workhouses, these grim, austere buildings that gave a minimum amount of relief during the Great Hunger. Well, England, Wales and Scotland also had workhouses. They also had a poor law. But there were differences. Even though Ireland was part of the United Kingdom since 1800 and subject to the same laws from Westminster, the Irish poor had been treated more severely than the British poor ever were. And so when Irish people landed in Britain, they were not entitled to go into the workhouses in any part of Britain. And this meant that they avoided the workhouses. If Irish people were found to be asking for relief, they could be instantly deported back to Ireland, which seems very cruel. But a number of them were. It's been estimated in Liverpool alone, between 1846 and 1853, almost 63,000 Irish were deported back to Ireland. And this shows us a number of things. It shows us that the Irish people, the Irish poor, were not regarded as equal partners within the United Kingdom. At Ireland's greatest hour of need, they were really abandoned, and quite literally abandoned, because when people were taken back to Ireland, they were just left in the ports of Belfast, of Dublin, wherever. They were not taken back to their own homes. So it was a very cruel system. And it showed how the British government, even in a time of famine and of crisis, really did not bend its rules to help the starving Irish, either in Ireland or when they landed on the shores of Britain. So, given the fleeing Irish who came to Britain were not entitled to relief, how did they survive? And they survived in a number of ways. Some of them simply went underground. They didn't reveal themselves to the authorities. They did not want to be deported. Others relied on temporary soup kitchens that had been set up by the people of Liverpool. And we know, both in Ireland and elsewhere, it was due to the philanthropists, to the caregivers, to the charitable, that the Famine Irish survived. And in this sense, Liverpool was no different than anywhere else. One of the very first donations that was raised in Liverpool came from people who themselves were poor. They were called navvies, and navvies is the short term for navigators. And it was these navvies or navigators who built the railways, who built the canals in Britain and elsewhere. And it was a highly dangerous employment, and many of them were Irish, as we know. As early as November 1846, navvies working on the railway system in Liverpool had donated a day's wage to famine relief. And throughout the next year, there were many other instances of the people of Liverpool donating to the famine Irish. But even though it's a tragic tale, we know within this complex story, there are people who really emerge as heroes. And top of the list is a man called William Rathbone. And anybody who's familiar with Liverpool will know of the famous Rathbones. William also had a philanthropic sister, Eleanor. And William Rathbone held meetings in Liverpool. He sent money to Ireland, and he tried to raise consciousness. And in his mind, he was very clear that those who fled Ireland, the poor victims of the famine, were also the victims of a cruel system of landlordism. And he argued that the landlords should be taxed to look after the poor of Ireland. But William Rathbone is remarkable for another reason. In 1847, the people of Boston sent a ship to the port of Cork, and it was laden with food. This ship was called the Jamestown. All of the people employed on the ship were volunteers. And the captain of the ship, again a volunteer, Captain Forbes, who arrived in Cork. And when he arrived in Cork, William Rathbone travelled from Liverpool to meet him, to welcome him, and to help him distribute food. So he is a real hero, a hero both in Liverpool and in Ireland. And also, and we often don't know their names, but we know that a number of Catholic priests died, particularly in the parish of St. Anthony. St. Anthony's parish lay near to the docks, near to the Clarence dock, where the Irish would have landed, and en route out of Liverpool. So most of those who landed, including the Strokestown 1,490, would have passed by St. Anthony's Church, and many of them would have gone there for succour. And we know that 10 priests from that parish died, giving relief to the poor Irish. We also know, and this was only discovered really within the last 20 years, that St. Anthony's Church on Scotland Road is the site of a mass famine grave. We don't know precisely how many people are buried there, over 2,000 probably, but when the grave was uncovered in about 2004, it was stacked 5 foot deep with the remains of people from the famine. So even in the midst of tragedy, there are always tales of heroism. And for those of us familiar with these tales, we should take comfort today as we face our own crisis and our own pandemic, which has so many parallels with what happened in Ireland and elsewhere in the 1840s. So what was the legacy of the famine in Liverpool? Well, even before the famine, there were about 60,000 Irish living in Liverpool. But what the famine did was it made the Irish in Liverpool overwhelmingly Catholic, and that really changed the complexion of the city. Sometimes not always in a good way, because it was traditionally a Protestant city, and throughout the 19th century and indeed the 20th century, there were a number of sectarian conflicts. But for Irish people who grew up in the city of Liverpool, they very much stayed close to their Irish heritage. We always say that Liverpool is the 33rd county of Ireland, or some of my friends refer to it as East Dublin. So the links remain very, very strong. And we know in terms of culture, the links have remained and have really thrived in many ways. If we think about one of Liverpool's greatest exports, apart from its soccer team, the Beatles, and 3 of the Beatles claimed Irish heritage, and John and Paul in particular, but John especially, was very proud of his Irish heritage. And John always said, "When I'm 64, I want to retire to my island off the coast of Mayo." Sadly, we know he didn't make that, but that's how much he loved Ireland. So I would just like to say congratulations to the Great Famine's Roadshow. Although you can't be on the ground at the moment for reasons of safety for all of us, I really appreciate the fact that you thought creatively through this issue we're confronting and that you're continuing to stay in touch with the Irish diaspora everywhere. So to everyone who has made this possible, including the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin, very big thank you.